Hello again. In this video, I thought I'd talk about the original belt system that was used in Taekwondo. Now, I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find any school that still uses the original belt system. Most schools have gotten to the point now where they start introducing orange belts and purple belts and all sorts of different belts that have not ever been in any Taekwondo belt system, but a lot of schools just want to get the money for the test, so they start adding all these half-colored belts and a zillion stripes between every belt level, and after a while it becomes a joke. But if you want to go back and take a look at what the original belt system looked like and how it compares with the modern system, I've created a little illustration here in the spreadsheet just to show that. So in the original system, and you can find this, by the way, in the 1965 text, which was the first English book on Taekwondo written by the founder of Taekwondo. So this is ITF style, which is the original style of Taekwondo and the oldest style of Taekwondo. And of course, it's important to understand that the original belt system in martial arts was that there essentially were no colors. My understanding is you would basically start with a white belt, and the belt had no significance other than it holds up your pants, it holds the uniform together. And what would happen over time, so again, this is not in Taekwondo, but this is for martial arts that precede Taekwondo. What would happen is you would just start out with a clean white belt, and the belt was used for nothing other than holding your uniform together, holding your pants up. And as you trained over a period of time and you continued to use the same belt, that belt would get progressively more and more dirty, right? You can imagine over time that crisp, shiny new white belt, as you have it, it starts to fade, it starts to get dirty, it starts to look more and more gray and dull, and it's starting to go towards being a black belt. And so my understanding is that's how this whole system of going from white to black belt actually started, was this idea that you start with a shiny new white belt, and just through years and years of wear and tear, that white belt gradually darkens until it never really becomes black, but it becomes darker and darker. And so hence you could tell the difference between a new student and an advanced level student by how worn out, how dirty and darkened their belt was. And as it got more and more towards black, then you could tell that that was a higher and higher level student. So anyway, take that with a grain of salt, but that was my understanding. That's what I've always heard was kind of how belt systems got started in martial arts, period. But in Taekwondo, the very first belt system did not have the belts that we know today. You did start at white belt, so that was the same. However, there was no equivalent to yellow belt. So there was no yellow belt in the original Taekwondo system. And in fact, you didn't have 10 gups of color belt from white belt until you got up to black belt. There were actually 8, and they referred to them as grades. They didn't refer to them as gups. So they were referred to grades. So if you were a new student, you started at what was called 8th grade. Today, that would be called 10th gup. And then the numbers count down, 10, 9, 8, 7, until you get down to 1. Then you get black belt, and it starts to count up again. 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree of black belt. So it's this very confusing system of numbers that count down and then count up, which doesn't really translate well into Western culture, because here you would never say that 7th grade was above 8th grade. Doesn't make sense. When you go to school, 1st grade is where you start, then second grade, third grade, fourth grade. The higher the number, the higher the level, the more advanced you are. Again, Western culture, I don't know why they decided to do things backwards over in Korea, but that's the way it is. So there's no direct comparable to these two systems. I'm just showing you what is closest. So white belt and yellow belt in original Taekwondo would have just been white belt. As you move forward from there, you would get to your second belt in the original system, and believe it or not, your second belt would be blue belt. So for a modern Taekwondo student, you can imagine what the jump would be from white belt to blue belt, because in a modern Taekwondo system, and I mean when I say modern, I mean a Taekwondo system that's existed for the last 50 or 60 years. Blue belt would be somebody that has years of training over a white belt, for example, to get there. So that would be a massive jump. But in the original belt system that existed back in the 1950s, 1960s, you went to blue belt as your next belt. So from there, moving forward, and again, I'm showing the original system here and the modern system on the right. Your next belt level in original belt system and original style Taekwondo would be brown belt. So the dreaded brown belt that is not used by most schools today, I would say, because of the negative connotations surrounding brown belt. So it often gets mocked, and for good reason. It was dropped from the modern belt systems. But once upon a time, after you got blue belt, the next belt you would progress to would have been brown belt. And brown belt would have been roughly analogous to today's blue belt or red belt student. And you would actually spend a very long time at brown belt. So each of these belts here, if you've been a Taekwondo student for some time, you know that the first few belts come pretty quickly, and then the later belts take longer to get. Well, in the original belt system of Taekwondo, you would spend quite a long time at each of these belt levels. You can imagine spending the better part of a year almost as a white belt. You would probably spend an entire year as a blue belt, and then you would definitely spend at least 1, if not 2 years as a brown belt in the original belt system that existed. And then finally we get to black belt. So in the original belt system, there were only 4 belts. And if you want to look at that here, this is straight out of the textbook where it's describing the uniform and it's describing the belts. But you can see it right there. That is the original belt system. Let's make sure that this is in focus so you can see this. Right, there it is. Right, and it shows the grades as well that you have for each of those levels. But that is the original belt system. And this is, when I say the modern equivalent, the system that almost every school has used for half a century or more now, is this system of belts. So it would be hard to imagine going back to the original belt system, because students like to feel that they're making progress. And if you're using a system of belts like this and you're spending years at the same belt, it feels like you're not moving forward. It feels like you're not progressing. And so you can imagine one of the main motivations for switching to the belt system that we have today is, again, so that you're giving students more feedback, more progress, smaller steps, if you will. So it feels like you're progressing towards the objective. Even though it still takes the same amount of time to get there, at least it feels like you're making progress because of the extra, extra levels that are in there. So anyway, I just thought that was something I'd put together a video on because it was kind of interesting. But there you have it. The original belt system in Taekwondo was only 4 belts. So, till next time, thanks for watching. Bye.